Can we actually see God? Well, of course, that all depends on exactly what you mean by that. I guess from a certain Western perspective, you might say, can we see God? From a more Eastern perspective, you might say, can we experience the divine? And obviously, there's different ways of looking at that. I think there's two major approaches that I would personally take. Number one, there is, of course, the mystical experience. We don't really know how people saw the divine or whatever manifestation of the divine there was thousands of years ago when all of these holy writings were written, and people talk about actually talking to God, the divine, whatever that is, whether it be through a burning bush or personally speaking with he, she, it, or simply feeling he, she, it's presence, however you want to put that. There is the mystical approach. And whether those people were having what we would now call mystical experiences or were gods just walking the earth, we don't know, and I'm not going to try to make a supposition on that. But what I will say is that I think there's also another way. You can have a personal mystical experience, however that experience is, whether it be a near life experience or it be through meditation or some people through drug use, whatever that is that connects you with the divine, there is that approach. The other approach, in my personal opinion, is a somewhat more, shall we say, reasoned approach, which is that you can experience God purely through looking around you, purely through nature. You can see purpose, or at least I personally see purpose. Not everyone does. I personally believe that you can look around you, look at nature, look at the entire universe, look at the way it is all put together, and you can see order or chaos. And I literally believe those two are both true. I think that you can see purpose and you can see non-purpose. And I personally, as my particular kind of omnist, choose to see purpose. And so when I look at the world around me, I see an incredible amount of purpose. Does that mean that purpose is there? Well, yes, I think for me it is there. I think that to some extent each and every one of us are our own universe because we only really know what we know. We really only experience what is in our own minds, and however consciousness actually works, as far as we know here at the moment, unless we're in some transcendental state where we're connecting up with everyone in the entire universe or what have you, as far as we know, we only experience what we experience. So as far as I am personally concerned, yes, there is purpose. I look around and I see these patterns. I see the way humankind is going. I see very simplistic things, like the fact that animals were looked at very differently 100 years ago. How you have several countries now that are considering some animals to be sentient when at one time they weren't considered to be sentient. And I think that's a pretty significant jump for us. I think that simply in the fact that, for instance, on the animal thing, we don't necessarily have to eat animals now. Now, there's several traditions like Buddhism, certain forms of Hinduism and Jainism, where eating animals has been considered barbaric and a lowering of the karma. And even in some of those traditions, it's considered that the eating of plants actually isn't necessarily good for your karma, but it's considerably better than eating animals because, of course, animals are more sentient than plants. And some people will argue that plants actually are very sentient and we just don't know it. And that could be true. I have no idea. But when I look around at the way the world has worked, particularly in this respect because I think it's interesting, not only are some countries and some, or should I say some cultures, looking at animals as being more sentient and at least recognizing that some animals are every bit as much alive as we are, maybe not as conscious, It depends on obviously the culture, but some cultures do seem to feel that at least the higher animals, the animals that demonstrate to us in a certain way, like dolphins and chimpanzees, demonstrate to us something that we relate to as intelligence. Those cultures start seeing them as more sentient. Right now I'm particularly talking about India, and I think there's a few other countries now that have started looking into considering some of those animals to be sentient. But not only do you see cultures looking at them that way, but you also see an actual movement toward the ability to not eat them if you didn't want to. Agriculture has obviously increased greatly in the last several hundred years, to the point that right now you can be vegetarian if you want to be vegetarian. You can be vegan if you want to be vegan. You can do just about anything except perhaps one of these people who believe in only eating air, and I don't think they really exist. But they think they do, and that's what matters. But as technology progresses, we may ultimately get more and more to the point that, for instance, they are trying to grow meat, brainless meat, mindless meat in labs. Now, as disgusting as that might sound, ultimately it is a way of eating meat without ever harming an animal. And ultimately, who knows, 100 years, 200 years from now, we might be able to make all our own proteins, and one day not have it not be necessary to harm any living thing. And whether or not that's the purpose, it is interesting to look around and see that we are moving towards that possibility. That even as we progress toward more and more of an ability to destroy our entire world, which we do have now, we literally can push a couple of very annoying red buttons and the entire Earth explodes. Even as we progress towards that, we are also coming to amazing understandings in medicine, abilities to filter water. Our entire Earth is covered in water, and yet we can't use most of it. But we're getting more and more to the point that we can. And through technology, we are progressing. We are progressing towards the possibility of becoming even more spiritual, if that were possible. I mean, let's take, this is just an example. I'm not telling everyone to go out and be vegetarian. I'm just using this as an example. But let's say for a moment that some of those modes of thought that tend toward the vegetarian side of things, that perhaps even state that eating plants isn't necessarily good for your karma, if you want to take things from the karmic end of things. Well, technology could eventually move to the point where none of that were necessary, and therefore your karma would go up. Now again, I'm not trying to purport that particular belief here. I'm simply saying it is interesting to look around and see how the world is moving in those directions. And in those things, I do see God. If by God you mean a purpose. I do see the divine moving through the world. And as I look around and I see these patterns in human behavior, I see how technology has forced us to reconcile racism, how, first of all, transportation forced us to reconcile races to a great extent, because as transportation became more and more viable, you had many more cultures in one area and they had to get along with each other. And now more and more communication is allowing that to happen. And I really feel that technology, even though I know some of us see technology as being an enemy, I see technology as being very much neutral. And neutral, to an extent, everything is neutral. But you can look at the evil side of it or the good side of it. And particularly at the moment, I'm looking at the good side of it. I am seeing how technology has forced man to get along in so many ways, even as it has increased our ability to kill each other, which I find highly fascinating. And of course, I'm one of those people that very much hopes that eventually, as we come to a greater and greater understanding of each other, and as our culture moves closer together in certain ways, we will have less and less need of those dangerous technologies. And hopefully eventually we can move them completely into the past. Do I see the divine in that? Yes, I do. I don't necessarily have to have an experience, a mystical experience to see purpose in the world I live in. For whatever that's worth, just a few things to think about. I'm the Urban Omnist. I look forward to all the comments. In looking back at this video, I kind of feel the need to, let's say, put a note on the end of this, because while I was talking about seeing God through mystical means and through logically looking at nature, that was obviously in counterpoint to the most common way that we see God, but I didn't actually talk about it because, of course, to me it was kind of obvious, but in looking back on it, that was it was kind of silly to leave it out, which is through faith. And that is the way that most people really do see God. They see he, she, it, the universe, the divine, however you want to put it, through faith. They assume that that exists for whatever reason, either because they've had something happen in their life, perhaps something good, perhaps something bad. It happens in different ways. But not everybody has a mystical experience. I'm not even sure that I can say that I've ever had what I would fully call a mystical experience. I've had mystical-like experiences. I've had things that were very close, but I certainly won't say that those are what led me to my present belief system. And I think for everybody, to some extent or the other, it really does begin with faith. In fact, even when you consider people who had mystical experiences, we have to have faith in that mystical experience. Obviously, some people might have an experience and just say, well, it was a hallucination, it wasn't real, I don't care, and it doesn't have any effect on their lives. And there's people who might very, logically or however you want to put that, look out at nature, look out at things and say, well, so? And not have any experience off that whatsoever. So faith obviously plays a great role in spirituality, perhaps even the greatest role. And so when I was talking about those two ways, the mystical and the non-mystical way of seeing the divine, it was only in counterpoint to faith, which, yes, I consider that probably to be the most important thing in the world, even in science. I think that if we don't have faith, we don't ever make that next step. I think faith is what gets you up in the morning. I think that when some people think about faith, they think about it in very Christian terms, or a very simplistic version of Christian terms. I'm not saying that all Christians have a simplistic view of faith, but to me, faith is very, very broad. When you're driving down the road at 100 miles an hour and you see a hill, you don't necessarily slow down. Why? Because we assume on the other side of that hill, there's still road. That may not be true. It's possible the road got washed out yesterday, but there's a good possibility that road is still there. And that is the only thing that allows us to do many of the things we do. We do assume that the sun will come up tomorrow. We do assume we will be alive tomorrow. We may not. We may die while we're asleep. It's possible. But without that faith, life would lose meaning. And I know that some people don't like to term that faith, but ultimately it's what it is. It's part of what makes us human. It is what allows us to overcome some of the unfortunate stark realities of life, which are that one day we will grow old and die, or we may die of a disease, we may die of a freak accident, and yet we still keep going, and that is because of faith. So I'm certainly not trying to downplay the role of faith in our spirituality. I'm the Urban Omnist, yet again, adding a little note onto that last video. Thank you very much. Can we see God? Well, yeah, you can if you're crazy. Can we see God? Well, Can we actually see God? I mean, let's say for a moment. No, forget that. And remember, guys, none of this works without you. So, subscribe to our channel, like us on Facebook and Twitter, and above all, don't forget to send me those questions.